Hello. Yeah, I'm John Cooperman. I'm going to be talking about accessibility today, and specifically making accessible modern web apps. So kind of some of the difficulties as the structure of applications changes and the effects of that on accessibility. Um, I'm John. I'm at jcoop on all the things like Twitter and GitHub and all that, and I like talking about accessibility and tech a lot. So if anybody wants to reach out after, feel free. So I do a lot of talks and workshops on accessibility, and I often have a difficult time describing it or talk to people that have slightly different understandings of what we're talking about. So I kind of like to start off by talking about really similar fields, but fields that are not going to be the topic of today's discussion. So for example, web performance, there's a really good argument here about people in developing nations with slow network speeds, and therefore having a really performant, a really fast app is going to be the thing that makes or breaks it for other people, whether they can use your app, whether it's accessible to them. And that's really valid and really, really important, but it's not specifically the accessibility that we're talking about today. Similarly, same vein, internationalization. So if you have an app that's English only, it's going to be very difficult for non-English speakers to use your app, or they're going to have to use, a third-party translator to use it. So again, it's a really similar field, but a little different. And then the last one is just kind of general UI design, like how you structure your data, how you write your copy, what audience you write for. Again, these are all in the same vein of making websites or apps that are accessible to everybody. But specifically what we're going to be talking about today is making websites that people with disabilities can use. So I think accessibility it's a little bit of a vague definition, but for today's purposes, we're specifically talking about people with disabilities. And that can be a wide range of disabilities, but specifically people with disabilities being able to use your web app. And one thing I like, this is a quote from a resource called WebAIM that I'll go over later, but I really like this quote, which is that web accessibility means that people with disabilities can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with the web. And the last part is what I like, and that they can contribute to the web. So one of my favorite things about the web is it's not this read-only experience where somebody's creating content and you're digesting that content. All of it is the very source code is open, right? You could just copy it and put it on your own website, or you could, interact in all these different ways. So, and I also think that it kind of hits on this point of not, when you're thinking about making your website accessible, not going for this minimum, kind of good enough approach, but, really making the website or your application really rich and accessible, that people with disabilities can have that full range of experience when using or contributing to your site. So I like to start on this because before we get into making your apps or your sites or my apps or my sites accessible, I think it's important to mention that the web by nature is already accessible, very, very much so, even if your website is not. And that's true for my website too. So for example, they have this really cool site. Who's seen this before? This is the original website from CERN back in the early 90s or whatever. The introduction to the World Wide Web. And this site is completely usable by people with wide range of disabilities. If you're using assistive technology, those anchor tags have a lot of built-in functionality. The heading makes it very easy to parse the data. All the semantic tags that we'll kind of be diving into makes it really accessible. So this was a site made in 1991. Great, fully accessible, passes all of the tests that we're going to check out later. You skip to modern day, and obviously we're doing a lot more, but one thing that really goes out the window a lot is the accessibility of the apps that we're building. So kind of my pitch to you all as developers, designers, PMs, whatever, are the reasons that you should care. So the number one that I just mentioned, these are in no priority order here, is that we're the ones making it inaccessible, right? If you took your social network app and you just rendered from the server proper HTML one time, it would be pretty good. It's when you start making all these cool animations and these great experiences where you kind of click around, you do all this different stuff, and where you make your own checkboxes out of these fancy spans and images, that's where we're getting into the territory where it becomes difficult to use. Number two, it's a human rights issue. I think it's a really good task, and we'll kind of do some things later, try to empathize with people that may have some type of vision impairment, and how frustrating certain sites can be to use, doing things that you just have to do, buying an airline ticket or checking on your insurance or, all these different things. It is and will become more of a legal issue. So there are a few laws in the United States around accessibility and it's specific to websites and applications, but more and more we're seeing standards adopted and it becoming a legal human rights issue to have a website that is accessible. We'll talk about some of those specifics too. And then if those three don't get you, wouldn't you like to have more users, right? Like there's a whole group of people out here, and if your site is unusable to them, they can't become sweet customers to count as your MAUs, right? That's what we all want here. I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, so if none of that compels you, like reaching a way larger audience is a really good benefit too. One thing that I guess I'll say that I don't have written down there is, one of the things that I really like about accessibility work is I almost always find that when I'm making web apps better for people with disabilities to use, it's almost always the case that it improves the experience for everybody. You know, just using this semantic text, you know, making sure that your markup is done correctly, that things can be read properly, usually betters the experience all the way around. So one thing that I think is cool for people not super familiar with it is to talk about the different devices that people use to browse the web and how they work, and kind of help you kind of empathize from there what experiences people might be having on your sites or applications. So there's a large amount of people that are keyboard only, whether they lack the motor controls to use a mouse. It could be just preference. A lot of power users are keyboard only, a lot of different reasons. So that would mean that everything that can be done on your website should be able to be done with just a keyboard. Similarly, there's a lot of assistive technologies like head wands or mouth sticks. And these are basically, it's like you have access to one finger, right? So you're using either your head or your mouth to enter things onto the keyboard, one click at a time. So you could just imagine that it would be a lot slower. One of my favorite pieces of technology is the single switch. This helps a lot of people that don't have even the motor control for some of those other devices. So it's really just one button, and there's no like hit it on the side or front. It's just one click on off. And what it does is you hit it one time and it opens up this virtual keyboard, and it starts highlighting row by row on the keyboard. And when it gets down to the row that the character you want is, you click it again and it goes column by column now. So it goes through the row that you've selected, and then you hit it again, you choose your key. So this is a really awesome piece of technology, but you can imagine if it takes like 30 or 40 tabs to get into the content of your page, that's going to be a lot of clicking for these users. And then the last one that we're going to talk about are screen readers, which are a completely non-visual way to interact with the web. And so a screen reader is a piece of software that would be like on your laptop or on your phone, and it would digest that web content and read it out to you in a way that you can still interact with it. So it tells you if it's a link, it tells you if it's a list, how many items are in it, that kind of thing. So one really cool thing that we can do kind of right off the bat to make apps more accessible is keyboard shortcuts. So if there's a task that people are going to do a lot, like composing a new tweet or a new Facebook status, or requesting a ride from Uber at their current destination, we can put those things behind keyboard shortcuts. So instead of having to tab all the way through and hit enter, you can just hit, you know, like GR for get ride or something like that. So if you go to a lot of popular websites and you hit shift ? You'll get this list of keyboard shortcuts. So this is twitter.com's. And you can see like almost every action that you'd ever want to take on Twitter can be done with just 2 clicks of the keyboard. So go to your favorites, go to your profile, create a new tweet, mute a user, all of these different things can be done that easily. Very similarly, Facebook has one. A lot of the big sites have one. And the best way to get to them usually is by going to the site and hitting that ? button. Tiny plug, I have this library called Shortcut.js on my GitHub repo. It really is almost not a library. It just wraps a bunch of these common keyboard events and throws these really generic sounding events out that you can listen to. So like get next item, get previous item, and then you would have an event listener that plugs into that code. But anyway, something like this can be really great, can make a huge difference in experience for a lot of users. So I was considering doing live demos, and then I was like, I'm not going to do any live demos. But I thought it would be cool to take a site, like a really good site like GitHub, and try to get around just using the keyboard. So to do some like a normal task that I would do with just the keyboard. So I have an animated GIF here. So you can see kind of the blue bar at the top. I'm not sure if everybody in the back can see. It's kind of moving around. So that's focus content, right? It's showing me what items are focused. And eventually I kind of start scrolling through and I find the repository that I want to get to, and I hit enter on it and it takes me to that. So a few things there, like one, not hiding your focus rings. I see a lot of websites, a lot of applications, they don't like the look of that blue ring, so they get rid of it. But at that point, if you're not using a mouse, if you're using a keyboard to guide around, you have no idea where you are anymore. Another thing is like, you'll see at a certain point, when the GIF starts over again, you'll see in the very top left that skip content button. So those are called skip links, and they're really cool, they're really powerful. Basically, you hide this little hidden element, visually hidden, and you make it the very, very first item in your HTML, or you give it a tab index, which we'll get into later. And then when a user hits tab for the very first time, this little skip box will appear. and it says something like skip to main content or whatever. And basically that's helping users that are tabbing through not have to tab through your entire header every time. So you'll see it like on a lot of news sites where, or Wikipedia, you know, has all the different languages and all the categories. It'd be really burdensome if you had to tab through all of those each time. So when you hit tab the first time, a skip link will appear. And then just for those that don't know, the way I've been getting around is tab to go forward to the next focusable item, shift tab to go backwards, and then enter to interact with an item. And that'll work for the majority of sites because that's the way the actual DOM elements work, like your anchor tags, your buttons, things like that. Now try using a screen reader. So for those that have Macs, you can go to your settings and you can turn on VoiceOver, which is a free screen reader that comes with Mac. Android and iOS phones have great screen readers. Windows has a lot to choose from. And so what I'll show here is not the sound, but the little box is going to pop up on the screen and it'll show you what it's reading out. So again, I'm on GitHub here. It's a little far away for me to see, but you can kind of see like GitHub web content. I hit tab, it says skip to web content. And as I'm kind of moving around, it tells me what kind of elements I'm interacting with, you know, what they probably do, all these different things. So this is like a really good experience where I can move around. If you didn't have any of this, which we'll show how to implement in a minute, it would be very difficult to do so. So as far as like the actual like kind of working group around accessibility, it's the Way ARIA standard. I'm not sure how many people have heard of it, but basically it's a W3 spec, much like CSS or HTML. And it specifies all these different ARIA things, like situations. If you have an image, you should have alt text, like all these different things. It's a lot to go through. So there's this really cool site that I use all the time called WebAIM. And WebAIM has this very human readable checklist that you can kind of walk through real fast, get a gist of what it is to make your website accessibility compliant, and go from there. So one example on the WebAIM checklist is here for images, and it just has its recommendations in plain English, right? Like all images, form buttons and image map hotspots have appropriate equivalent alternate text. Things that you can just kind of read through. You can click through if you want more information. But the W3 specs, I don't know, has anybody ever read any of the W3 specs? They're really proper. They're really hard to get through, right? So I wouldn't recommend going there because you'll probably feel defeated like I did. But instead I would go here. It's like a single page app. You can just read through all of these things and kind of start seeing what it means to have an accessible website. Okay, so if you have your web app, your website, whatever you're working on, you kind of want to know where you're at with accessibility. I have this like little 3-part process. So the first part is we'll analyze it. There's a lot of really cool tools that are free that'll give you all that information. So one tool is by the company Khan Academy, and they have this tool called Totally. You'll often see A11Y as like an acronym for accessibility, which is 11 letters long. It's just a thing that you'll see, or call people allies that are into accessibility. So this one is like a little tooltip that you load up on your site, and you can kind of see that it gives you a bunch of feedback about, you know, whenever it finds accessibility violations, exactly where it is, and it'll highlight it for you on the screen. In a really similar vein, DQ is a company that specializes in accessibility. They have like the rule set that a lot of other companies use for like how to detect accessibility violations, and they also have a browser plugin called Axe. So you load up Axe on your page, whether it's local or in production, and you click Analyze, and again, it gives you back a bunch of this feedback. Very similarly, Chrome DevTools now have one built in. If you go to the audits panel and you click Start Audit, you can click an accessibility audit, and it'll give you a score and show you what's going on. Then there's this really cool site called tenon.io. I have links at the end for all these things, but they all kind of do the same stuff. They analyze your site. They give you a bunch of good feedback. So step 2, now you've got this list of issues. I think one thing I always like to drive home is that fixing accessibility issues is pretty easy. Like it's usually HTML. It's usually adding a few properties, adding a few attributes. This isn't like performance testing where you analyze, you find out the site's slow, and then you spend like 3 more months figuring out why the site's slow. Like this is usually like, hey, put a language reference here. Like, hey, put an alt tag here. So it's pretty easy to go through and fix. So for example, taking the Chrome DevTools readout of the site that I had earlier, and it has 2 pieces of feedback. 1, images need alt text, and 2, the HTML tag needs a language attribute. That's my 2 pieces of feedback. So I can take some code, like here, a little React app that makes the image, right? And so you can see that image source equals cat, and all I do is I add some descriptive text. And what the alt text is doing, if people aren't familiar, you may have used it before because it is what will display if your image fails to load. And you may have used it before because for years we were told that in order to get your website to rank on Google, you got to stuff it full of as much stuff as possible. I did that. I don't know. But what it's really cool for is screen readers, right? So these non-visual content, when they hit it, you know, they'll read out whatever you put in there. So you'll put a description of the image in there, and then contextually makes a lot more sense, especially for non-sighted users. And then the other thing is I'll take this little HTML here, and then at the very top, I'll just add a lang attribute, lang equals English, and bam, got all that stuff figured out back to 100% on there. And then 3, prevent regression. So this is the thing, these are some tools that I really like that just help you once you've kind of conquered all those accessibility things to make sure that they stay gone. There's a really cool ESLint plugin for anybody that's using a framework that uses JSX. So that would be like React and Vue and Preact and a bunch of those. And basically it's an ESLint plugin. So it's just going to go through as you're writing your code, and it'll give you, so this is like how to set it up or whatever, you npm install it, you add it as a plugin, you extend from the rule set, and then you'll get cool little errors like this, right? So it's the exact same thing, like, you know, the image needs an alt prop, there's a emoji wrapped in span that needs a roll of emoji. It'll just kind of give you these things. So if you make it part of your build tool, then you can ensure that going forward, people won't be recommitting these accessibility violations. Cool, yeah, thanks so much. That's my talk. There's a bunch of all the resources that I mentioned are here. And yeah, come hang out and talk with me afterwards if you'd like.